Out of all the vehicles in the US Army's inventory, there is one that has received an avalanche of undue criticism. The Bradley fighting vehicle, also known as the M2 IFV or M3 CFV, has been lambasted ever since it was put into service, mostly by those in the military reform movement. It was even the focus of Pentagon Wars, a satirical movie about military bureaucracy. The common complaints are that it was too lightly armored, too tall, couldn't carry enough men, and tried to fill too many roles. These seem reasonable on paper, but in practice, these weren't the issues the Bradley had. We won't be talking too much about the Bradley's origins, as I've already done that. Instead, we'll be focusing on how it was received by those who used it. The Bradley was developed as a direct counter to the Russian BMP, one of the first IFVs ever made, and as a successor to the M113 APC. The BMP was a revolutionary design, a low-profile vehicle that could carry 8 dismounts, had a smoothbore gun for use against infantry and light vehicles, and an ATGM for use against tanks. On the other hand, the M113 was a battlefield taxi, a simple aluminum box. It was used to ferry infantry from point A to point B. It was lightly armed and armored, which posed a significant problem in Vietnam. The M113 couldn't provide adequate support for its dismounts, couldn't counter other armored vehicles, and was easily destroyed by pretty much anything that wasn't a rifle. The Army recognized that if M113s came up against BMPs, it would not be a fair fight. They needed a vehicle that could both carry troops and engage light armored vehicles. These efforts began in the 60s, but due to budget constraints, the Vietnam War, and a decided lack of focus, a usable vehicle wouldn't show up until the mid-70s. This vehicle was the XM732, which would carry 9 men, have a turret with a 25mm cannon, spaced laminate armor that would stop heavy machine guns, amphibious capability, and the mobility to keep up with tanks. Due to the aforementioned budgetary constraints, it would have to double as a recon vehicle. It was renamed to the XM2/XM3. The turret was revised, now housing both the commander and gunner. An elevating tow missile launcher was also added. This greatly extended the vehicle's effective engagement range, and allowed it to fend off tanks, but it also meant that the vehicle could only carry 6 dismounts instead of 9. However, this was seen as a worthy trade-off. It entered service in 1979, and was named the Bradley shortly thereafter. The Bradley was generally well liked by those who used it. Crews appreciated its enhanced speed, agility, firepower, and protection, but some had difficulty making the adjustment to a new platform. Compared to the M113, the Bradley was a far more complex system, having multiple weapon systems that crews had to become familiar with manning and maintaining. The Bradley brought an overall manpower reduction to units, and some officers were not enthralled by this, but some believed the extra firepower was worth it. The Soviets were well known for having scores of armored fighting vehicles. If units had no IFVs of their own, extra infantrymen wouldn't turn the tide. Pretty much immediately, the Bradley drew negative attention from outside the army, and not all of it was unwarranted. A few Bradleys were lost when they tried to swim, the transmission was proving to be unreliable, and there were numerous electrical problems. The Bradley's survivability was criticized the most, however. The Bradley did meet its requirements, there were just some who believed the requirements weren't stringent enough. If the Bradley was going to be serving alongside tanks, it should be armored like a tank, which was simply not feasible. The Army was worried about the weight and cost increase that would come with these modifications, but they did make some concessions. The amphibious requirement was dropped altogether, and the Bradley received applique armor. This would protect it from 30mm autocannons, like those used by the BMP-2. The amphibious requirement never made much sense anyway, since the M1 Abrams was an amphibious. To decrease the chance of an ammunition explosion, the ammunition was restowed, and the Bradley's water supply was moved closer to it. Throughout the 1980s, the Bradley's reliability was steadily improved, and eventually reached a satisfactory level. It first saw combat in Operation Desert Storm, where it received high praise. Quoting a Government Accounting Office report, the Bradley performed well during the war, according to the observations of commanders, crews, maintenance personnel, and Army after-action reports. It exhibited good reliability, lethality, mobility, and range, and crews perceived the A2 model to have good survivability. Although crews were very satisfied with the Bradley's performance, they identified various hardware deficiencies, though these problems usually did not stop the system in combat. The Army is aware of most of them, leaking radiators, unreliable heaters, and misdirected exhaust, and are planning on corrective actions. Army crews also identified other needed vehicle improvements, such as the addition of a laser rangefinder, friend or foe system, better sight magnification and resolution, and a faster reverse speed. So back to the common complaints. As for armor, even on the initial Bradley model, it was better protected than most vehicles at that time, and after the A2 upgrades, it had as much armor as it could without degrading performance. The Bradley is tall, but not very tall for Western IFVs. It's about as tall as a martyr, and a few inches taller than a warrior. The BMP is smaller by a good deal, but to achieve this, it made concessions to its survivability and comfort. During recon tests, the Bradley's height was not an issue. Its speed relative to the Humvee was. The Army preferred the Humvee for pure scouting, but for counter-recon and probing, preferred the Bradley. As for trying to fill too many roles, that's a bit of a half-truth, but it comes down to doctrine, not design. When the Army first received the Bradley, they had no idea how to use it. They didn't know how an IFV should be employed, so they floundered, and many commanders were left dissatisfied. Some felt that the infantry were too attached to the Bradleys, which limited their effectiveness, especially in defensive roles. The Bradley did have issues, but they were primarily linked to developing and fielding an entirely new type of vehicle, not the design of the vehicle itself. There were some mechanical teething issues, but it was well liked by those who used it. Anyway, that's pretty much all I've got to say on the subject. If you guys have suggestions for video topics, let me know in the comments. If the video was informative, consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.